Whispers filled the opulent ballroom as the bride laughed, pointing directly at her overweight sister. 300 guests stared, waiting for the humiliated bridesmaid to run away in tears. Instead, she reached into her purse with shaking hands and dialed a single, unlisted number. 20 minutes later, the heavy oak doors of the grand hall blew open. A fleet of black armored SUVs surrounded the estate, and the most feared man in the city walked straight past the bride, to bow at her sister's feet. Crystal chandeliers cast a blinding, unforgiving light across the master bridal suite of Oheka Castle, a sprawling historic estate in Huntington, New York, that catered only to the ultra-wealthy. Chloe Henderson stood entirely still in front of a massive gilded mirror, her breath shallow, restricted by layers of cheap, stiff taffeta that dug mercilessly into her sides. She was a fat woman, a reality she had long since made peace with in her own private life, but one that her family treated as a terminal, highly offensive disease. Savannah, the bride and Chloe's younger sister by 3 years, stood a few feet away, practically vibrating with narcissistic glee. Savannah was the golden child, thin, blonde, ruthlessly curated, and wrapped in a custom Vera Wang gown that cost more than Chloe's annual salary as a senior forensic accountant at Deloitte. "I just don't understand why you couldn't have lost even 10 pounds for my big day, Chloe," Savannah sighed, adjusting a diamond hairpin. Her voice dripped with that particular brand of faux concern that was deadlier than outright venom. "I mean, I specifically ordered the bridesmaid dresses in a size 14, hoping it would motivate you. Now look at it. The seamstress had to add panels to the back. It looks like a tent." Chloe closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, fighting the familiar, burning sting behind her eyelids. The dress wasn't a tent. It was a hideous, aggressive shade of mustard yellow that washed out her pale complexion, and the hastily added panels in the back made it look like a Frankenstein creation. Savannah had done it on purpose. She had explicitly chosen a style and color that would humiliate Chloe, ensuring that the fat sister would stand at the altar as a stark, grotesque contrast to the glowing, perfect bride. "It fits fine, Savannah," Chloe said, her voice steady despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs. "Today is about you. Let's just focus on getting you down the aisle." Brenda Henderson, their mother, swept into the room holding a flute of champagne. She was a sharply angled woman with an expertly lifted face and eyes that only softened when they landed on her youngest daughter. When she looked at Chloe, her expression instantly curdled into a mask of polite disgust. "Chloe, for heaven's sake, suck your stomach in!" Brenda snapped, waving her manicured hand dismissively. "Derek's family is old money from Greenwich. The Montgomerys are practically royalty in Connecticut. I will not have you waddling down the aisle looking like you just raided a bakery. Stand behind the floral arrangements if you have to." The absolute cruelty of the words wasn't new, but today they felt sharper, heavier. Chloe had spent her entire 29 years being the punchline to the Henderson family's cruel jokes. She was the smart one, the one who had clawed her way to the top of a male-dominated financial sector through sheer brilliance and grit. But in her family's eyes, a master's degree and a 6-figure salary meant nothing if you couldn't fit into a sample size. A knock echoed through the suite, and Derek Montgomery, the groom, poked his head in. He was objectively handsome, with the sleek, polished look of an Ivy League graduate who had never faced a real consequence in his life. He smirked as his eyes swept over his beautiful bride. But when his gaze slid to Chloe, his upper lip curled in a barely concealed sneer. "Almost ready, ladies?" Derek asked, stepping into the room. "The photographer wants to get some shots of the bridal party before the ceremony." He paused, looking Chloe up and down. Wow, Chloe. That yellow is really something. Takes a lot of bravery to wear that much fabric. Savannah giggled, a high, tinkling sound that grated against Chloe's nerves. I told her she should have tried the juice cleanse with me, babe. Chloe gripped the edges of the vanity table, her knuckles turning white. A younger, weaker version of herself would have cried. She would have locked herself in a bathroom stall and sobbed until she threw up, consumed by the toxic shame her family so eagerly fed her. But Chloe wasn't that fragile girl anymore. Beneath the hideous mustard dress, strapped tightly to her thigh in a custom silk holster she had bought herself, was a heavy, encrypted satellite phone. It was a lifeline, a dangerous, unimaginable lifeline to a world her snobby elite family couldn't even begin to fathom. "I'll be down in a minute," Chloe said softly, turning away from the mirror. "I just need to fix my makeup." "Don't take too long," Brenda warned, already ushering Savannah and Derek out the door. "And for God's sake, put some powder on. You're sweating. Fat girls always sweat." The door clicked shut, leaving Chloe alone in the sudden, suffocating silence of the bridal suite. She exhaled a long, trembling breath, her hands coming up to rest on her soft, rounded stomach. She traced the curve of her waist, the fullness of her hips. She loved her body. It had carried her through late nights poring over corporate ledgers, through lonely holidays, through the cold reality of her existence. But more importantly, there was a man, a terrifying, impossibly powerful man, who worshipped every single curve she possessed. A memory flickered in her mind, pulling her back to a rainy Tuesday evening 6 months ago. She had been working late at the firm, auditing the books of a supposedly legitimate shipping conglomerate called Cosa Nostra Logistics. She had found millions in untraceable funds, ghost accounts, and offshore shell corporations. Being a diligent employee, she had prepared a report. Before she could file it, her office door had been locked from the outside. Gabriel Moretti had stepped out of the shadows of her own office. He was the head of the Moretti crime syndicate, the undisputed king of the city's underworld. He was 6'3" of lethal, coiled muscle, dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit, with eyes as black and cold as the bottom of the Hudson River. He had come to kill the accountant who had discovered his money laundering operation. Instead, he had found Chloe. She remembered the way his imposing frame had trapped her against her desk, the cold steel of a suppressed pistol resting against her hip. But when he had looked down at her, really looked at her, the violence in his eyes had shifted into something far more dangerous. Obsession. He had been captivated by her sharp mind, her defiance when she told him to pull the trigger or get out of her way, and most of all, her lush, soft body. He hadn't killed her. Instead, he had taken her home, effectively claiming her in a terrifying, intoxicating whirlwind of dark romance and unyielding protection. "You belong to me now, la mia regina," Gabriel had whispered against her collarbone months ago, his heavy Italian accent sending shivers down her spine. "Your battles are my battles. If anyone disrespects you, if anyone makes you feel less than the queen you are, you call me. I will burn their world to ash." Chloe shook her head, pulling herself out of the memory. Gabriel was in Chicago dealing with a rival cartel. She hadn't wanted to bother him with petty family drama. She had promised herself she could survive one weekend of Savannah's wedding. Just one weekend, and then she would go back to her quiet life and her secret dark king. But as she touched up her lipstick, she had no idea that the true nightmare of the evening hadn't even begun. The wedding reception was a masterclass in excessive, nauseating wealth. The grand ballroom of Oheka Castle had been transformed into a winter wonderland, dripping in thousands of white orchids, crystal centerpieces, and ice sculptures that cost more than cars. 300 of New York's elite sat at round tables draped in silk, eating beluga caviar and drinking vintage Dom Perignon. Chloe sat at the very edge of the head table, as far away from the bride and groom as physically possible. The corset of the mustard dress was cutting off her circulation, and her feet throbbed in heels that were a half size too small. Another deliberate oversight by Savannah. For the past 3 hours, Chloe had endured a barrage of thinly veiled insults, passive-aggressive pity, and outright cruelty. Derek's frat boy groomsman had spent the cocktail hour making pig noises whenever she walked past the hors d'oeuvres table. Her mother had publicly slapped a piece of wedding cake out of her hand, hissing that she was embarrassing the family by eating in public. Chloe had swallowed the humiliation, staring blankly at the wall, counting down the minutes until she could call an Uber and disappear forever. Then came the toasts. The best man, a trust fund degenerate named Preston, finished his speech with a raunchy joke that had the older guests clutching their pearls, though Derek laughed uproariously. Then Savannah stood up. She grabbed the microphone, her eyes sparkling with malicious intent under the spotlight. The room quieted down. "Thank you all so much for being here," Savannah began, her voice echoing through the massive ballroom. She dabbed at a fake tear. "Derek and I are so incredibly blessed to be surrounded by people who fit so perfectly into our lives." She paused, turning her gaze directly toward the end of the table where Chloe sat. 300 pairs of eyes followed the bride's line of sight, landing squarely on the plus-size woman shrinking into her yellow dress. "I especially want to thank my big sister Chloe for being my maid of honor," Savannah said, a wicked smile spreading across her perfectly glossed lips. "It couldn't have been easy for her today, watching me get married to the man of my dreams while she's still so focused on her career. And her meals." A low rumble of uncomfortable laughter rippled through the ballroom. Chloe felt her face burn, a hot, prickling sensation spreading across her chest. "I mean, I always knew I'd get married first," Savannah continued, pacing the stage, clearly relishing the microphone. "Mom always said you have to have the whole package to keep a man. But Chloe is so strong. She's literally the biggest person I know. It takes a lot of space to hold all that independence. So let's raise a glass to Chloe. May she one day find a man who can handle all of her." The room erupted into laughter, real, genuine, cruel laughter. Derek was practically howling, high-fiving Preston. Brenda sat at the parents' table, shaking her head in mock sympathy, completely endorsing the public slaughter of her eldest daughter's dignity. Chloe couldn't breathe. The walls of the grand ballroom seemed to shrink, the crystal chandeliers spinning wildly above her. The humiliation wasn't a slow ache. It was a violent, suffocating physical pressure. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the marble floor. The laughter died down slightly as she pushed past the head table. As she hurried toward the exit, Preston intentionally stuck his foot out into the aisle. Chloe tripped, stumbling hard. She didn't fall, catching herself on the edge of a guest table, but her movement knocked a full glass of red wine directly onto the lap of a wealthy dowager. "Watch it, Shamu!" Preston yelled, entirely unashamed. "God, she is so clumsy. Just get her out of here," Brenda hissed loud enough for half the room to hear. Chloe didn't look back. She broke into a heavy sprint, pushing through the heavy oak doors of the ballroom and fleeing down the quiet, carpeted corridors of the castle. She found an opulent, empty powder room, slammed the heavy wooden door shut, and locked the deadbolt. She collapsed against the marble sink, gasping for air. Hot, bitter tears streamed down her face, ruining her carefully applied makeup. She stared at her reflection. She saw the fat, the ugly yellow dress, the smeared mascara. She saw the woman her family had spent 3 decades trying to destroy. Why do I let them do this to me? She thought, a sob tearing from her throat. Why do I keep coming back for more? Her hand drifted down to her thigh. She felt the hard, rectangular shape of the encrypted phone hidden beneath her dress. Gabriel's face flashed in her mind, the way his dark, lethal eyes softened only for her, the way his massive hands held her as if she were made of spun glass and diamonds, the absolute terrifying devotion he had offered her, which she had kept hidden out of fear of what he truly was. She wasn't just a bullied fat girl. She was the woman who held the heart of the devil himself. Her trembling hands reached under the ruffled fabric of the dress. She pulled out the heavy black satellite phone. There was only one contact saved in the device. The screen glowed dimly in the luxurious bathroom. Chloe pressed call. It rang exactly half a time before a deep, gravelly voice echoed through the speaker, a voice that carried the weight of 1,000 sins. Chloe. He didn't ask a question. He stated her name like a prayer. Gabriel, she whispered, her voice cracking as another sob escaped her lips. Silence hung on the line for a terrifying second. When Gabriel spoke again, the soft, reverent tone was gone, replaced by a cold, murderous absolute that dropped the temperature in the bathroom by 10 degrees. Who made you cry? I'm at the wedding, Chloe choked out, sinking to the cold marble floor, hugging her knees to her chest. She humiliated me in front of everyone. They laughed at me, Gabriel. They called me a whale. They laughed. The sound that came through the phone wasn't human. It was the low, guttural snarl of an apex predator who had just been unchained. Where are you exactly? Gabriel asked, his voice dead flat. Oheka Castle, in Huntington. But Gabriel, you're in Chicago. I landed at JFK an hour ago to surprise you. My convoy is on the Long Island Expressway. I am 15 minutes away, mia dolcezza. Do exactly as I say. Wash your face. Fix your hair. Walk back into that ballroom. Hold your head up high and wait for me. Gabrielle, what are you going to do? Chloe asked, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She knew what this man was capable of. She had seen the news reports, the whispered rumors of his enemies disappearing into thin air. I am going to show 300 dead men, walking exactly who you belong to, Gabriel said smoothly. Now dry your tears. Queens do not weep for peasants. The line went dead. Chloe sat on the floor for a long moment, staring at the black screen of the phone. A strange, intoxicating warmth began to spread through her chest, replacing the cold terror and humiliation. She stood up, turning the faucet on and splashing cold water on her face. She wiped away the ruined makeup, smoothed down her hair, and stared at herself in the mirror. She didn't look like a victim anymore. She unlocked the bathroom door and walked back down the long corridor toward the ballroom. Every step she took felt lighter, her spine straightening, her chin lifting. She pushed open the grand oak doors and stepped back into the reception. The guests were dancing, drinking, and laughing. Savannah was on the dance floor with Derek, twirling in her expensive white gown. They didn't even notice Chloe slip back into the room and take her seat at the far end of the head table. She folded her hands in her lap, completely calm, and watched the heavy oak doors of the ballroom. She waited. The live band was halfway through a jazzy rendition of a pop song when the first sign of disruption occurred. It was subtle at first, a ripple of confusion near the front entrance of the ballroom. A waiter dropped a tray of champagne glasses, the glass shattering loudly against the marble floor, but nobody moved to clean it up. The waiter was staring out into the grand foyer, his face completely drained of color. Then the heavy oak doors, which had been propped open, were suddenly slammed shut from the outside. The band faltered, the music dying away in a discordant screech of a saxophone. The 300 guests murmured, heads turning toward the entrance. Savannah, annoyed by the interruption to her spotlight, stomped her foot on the dance floor. "Excuse me, who shut the doors? We're supposed to have an open flow to the terrace," Savannah shrilled, glaring at the event coordinator who was frantically whispering into a headset. Before the coordinator could answer, the oak doors exploded inward. They didn't just open. They were violently shoved apart with enough force to crack the wood. The silence that fell over the room was absolute, suffocating, and heavy with instant terror. 20 men flooded into the ballroom. They moved with terrifying, synchronized precision, forming a perimeter around the walls in less than 10 seconds. They were not security guards. They were dressed in immaculate black suits, their faces grim, unreadable masks of professional violence. Bulges beneath their tailored jackets betrayed the heavy weaponry they carried. 3 of them moved directly to the band, silently motioning for them to step away from their instruments. They did so without a sound. Brenda Henderson let out a sharp gasp, clutching her husband's arm. Derek took a hesitant step backward, his frat boy bravado evaporating into thin air. "What is the meaning of this?" Derek's father, a wealthy hedge fund manager, demanded, stepping forward with false authority. "I demand to know who is in charge here. I am calling the police." One of the men in black, Matteo, Gabriel's lethal, heavily tattooed underboss, stepped forward. He didn't raise his voice. He simply reached into his jacket, pulled out a massive Desert Eagle handgun, and racked the slide. The metallic clack-clack echoed through the cavernous room, like a bomb going off. Derek's father immediately backed away, raising his hands, his face pale as a ghost. Then the sea of armed men parted at the entrance. Gabriel Moretti walked into the ballroom. He moved with the slow, predatory grace of a man who owned the earth he walked on. He was dressed in a bespoke midnight black Tom Ford suit that hugged his broad, muscular shoulders perfectly. A silk tie rested against a crisp black shirt, monochromatic and terrifying. His dark hair was perfectly styled, and a faint scar ran through his left eyebrow, adding a rugged brutality to his impossibly handsome face. But it was his eyes that paralyzed the room. They were a terrifying, abyssal black, sweeping over the crowd of elite socialites, as if looking at a room full of insects. The air in the ballroom seemed to grow colder, the temperature plummeting under the sheer, suffocating weight of his aura. Savannah, frozen on the dance floor, stared at the billionaire Mafia kingpin in stunned silence. She didn't know who he was, but she understood power, and the man standing before her reeked of more wealth and danger than anyone she had ever met. Gabriel ignored her. He ignored Derek. He ignored the terrified gasps of the ultra-wealthy elite. His dark eyes locked onto the far end of the head table. His gaze found Chloe. Instantly, the lethal, terrifying mask on his face shattered. His eyes softened, a profound, consuming warmth flooding his expression as he looked at the plus-size woman in the hideous mustard dress. He didn't see the ugly fabric or the humiliated bridesmaid. He saw a goddess. Gabriel walked across the ballroom floor. The crowd parted for him instinctively, scrambling out of his way like mice fleeing a tiger. His heavy footsteps echoed in the absolute silence of the room. He walked past the massive wedding cake. He walked right past Savannah, who actually leaned forward, thinking for a delusional second that this dark, magnificent stranger was coming to admire her. He didn't even blink in her direction. Gabriel stopped in front of Chloe. She was looking up at him, her chest heaving, tears welling in her eyes. Not from sadness this time, but from an overwhelming wave of relief and awe. Slowly, deliberately, the most dangerous man on the eastern seaboard dropped to one knee in front of 300 stunned guests. Gasps rippled through the room. Brenda dropped her champagne glass. It shattered on the floor, forgotten. Gabriel reached out with large, scarred hands, gently taking Chloe's trembling fingers in his. He brought her knuckles to his lips, pressing a soft, lingering kiss against her skin. "I told you I would be here, amore mio," Gabriel murmured, his deep voice carrying easily in the dead, silent room. "Forgive me for making you wait." "Gabriel," Chloe whispered, a tear slipping down her cheek. He stood up, his massive frame towering over her as he gently pulled her up from her chair. His hands rested on her waist, pulling her soft, curvy body flush against his hard, muscular one. He didn't hide her. He didn't try to minimize her space. He held her like she was the most precious, exquisite treasure in the world, his thumbs soothingly tracing the fabric of the dress at her sides. "Chloe!" Brenda shrieked, finally finding her voice, her tone a mix of pure shock and outrage. "What is going on here? Who is this person?" Gabriel didn't let go of Chloe. He turned his head slowly, his eyes locking on to Brenda Henderson. The sheer, freezing violence in his stare made the older woman physically flinch backward. "I am the man who is going to marry your daughter," Gabriel said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that promised absolute destruction. "And you, along with every single person in this room, have approximately 60 seconds to apologize to my queen, or I will order my men to lock the doors and burn this castle to the ground." Panic attempted to bloom in the grand ballroom of Oheka Castle, but it was suffocated instantly by the terrifying synchronized sound of 20 assault rifles being raised and aimed at the ceiling. The message was clear. No one was leaving, and no one was breathing without Gabriel Moretti's explicit permission. Arthur Montgomery, Derek's father and the CEO of Montgomery and Croft Wealth Partners, tried to salvage his crumbling authority. He puffed out his chest, his face purple with indignation. "Do you have any idea who we are? We have the chief of police on speed dial. You can't just storm in here and hold the most influential families in New York hostage over her." He pointed a shaking, manicured finger at Chloe. Gabriel didn't even flinch. His dark eyes lazily tracked the older man's finger, and then he gave a nearly imperceptible nod to his underboss. Matteo crossed the dance floor in 3 long strides. He didn't speak. He simply grabbed Arthur Montgomery by the collar of his custom Armani tuxedo and kicked the back of his knees. The billionaire hedge fund manager collapsed onto the marble floor with a pathetic yelp, the wind knocked out of him. Matteo kept a heavy combat boot pressed firmly between Arthur's shoulder blades, pinning him to the ground in front of the horrified elite. "The chief of police, Arthur?" Gabriel's voice was dangerously quiet, slicing through the room like a scalpel. He pulled a custom platinum smartphone from his jacket pocket and tossed it onto the pristine white tablecloth of the head table. "Call him. Call Commissioner Thomas Harding. Ask him why he approved the rerouting of all local patrol cars away from the Huntington estate tonight. While you're at it, ask him how much my syndicate deposited into his offshore Caymans account yesterday." Arthur stared at the phone, his face draining of all color. A collective gasp rippled through the guests. The realization crashed down upon the room. Their wealth, their status, their country club memberships meant absolutely nothing here. They were trapped in a cage with a monster who owned the people they usually paid to protect them. Gabriel turned his attention back to Chloe. She was trembling slightly against him, the adrenaline coursing through her veins. He lifted a large, warm hand and gently cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing away a stray tear that had escaped her lashes. "Who tripped you, Mia Regina?" Gabriel asked softly, his tone completely at odds with the brutal violence surrounding them. "Who dared to put their hands on what is mine?" Chloe swallowed hard. She looked out at the sea of terrified faces. Her family had bullied her into submission for nearly 30 years. They had trained her to be small, to take the abuse, to apologize for taking up space. But with Gabriel's immovable strength acting as a shield behind her, the lifetime of toxic shame began to fracture. She lifted a trembling finger and pointed toward the groomsmen's table. "Him? Preston." Preston, the trust fund degenerate who had called her a whale and stuck his foot out to trip her, turned chalk white. He tried to scramble backward out of his chair, but 2 of Gabriel's soldiers were already on him. They dragged him by the lapels of his suit, his expensive dress shoes dragging uselessly against the floor, and threw him violently onto the ground at Gabriel's feet. "Please," Preston sobbed, his bravado entirely gone. "It was a joke. It was just a stupid joke. She's clumsy. I swear I didn't mean anything by it." Gabriel stared down at the weeping man, with the detached disgust of someone looking at a cockroach. "You looked at a queen and treated her like dirt," Gabriel said, his voice dropping to a terrifying guttural rumble. "You mocked a woman who has more brilliance in her little finger than you possess in your entire hollow, pathetic lineage. You saw a lush, beautiful, perfect woman, and you tried to break her to make your insignificant self feel tall." Gabriel stepped forward, his polished dress shoe coming down hard on Preston's outstretched hand. The sickening crunch of breaking bones echoed through the silent ballroom. Preston screamed, a high-pitched wail of agony, but the armed men at the perimeter stepped forward, ensuring no one moved to help him. "My beautiful Chloe is exactly as she is meant to be," Gabriel declared, his voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers. "Every soft curve, every inch of her body is worshipped by me. If I ever hear that anyone in this room, anyone in this city, has uttered a single disrespectful syllable about her weight, her appearance, or her name, I will not just kill you. I will dismantle your businesses. I will freeze your trust funds. I will erase your entire legacy from the earth." He removed his foot from Preston's shattered hand, looking back up at Brenda Henderson, who was openly weeping in terror at the parents' table. "Now," Gabriel commanded, the absolute authority of the underworld kingpin vibrating in the air. "I said I wanted apologies. Start." It was a surreal, humiliating spectacle. For the next 10 minutes, the wealthiest, most snobbish socialites in New York City lined up. One by one, under the cold, lethal gaze of the Mafia and the barrels of assault rifles, they approached Chloe. They bowed their heads. They apologized. Brenda Henderson shook uncontrollably as she stood before her eldest daughter. Chloe, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Please, just tell him to leave us alone." Chloe looked at her mother, the woman who had monitored her food since she was 7, who had forced her into diet camps, who had made her feel unlovable, Chloe felt no pity. She felt nothing but a profound, liberating emptiness. "You aren't sorry, Mother," Chloe said quietly, her voice steady. "You're just scared. But I accept it. Because after tonight, you will never see me again." Savannah could not take it anymore. The bride, whose entire existence revolved around being the center of attention, had been pushed into the background of her own million-dollar wedding. Her golden moment was ruined. The elite guests she had so desperately wanted to impress were currently groveling at the feet of the fat sister she despised. The narcissistic rage bubbled over, overriding her self-preservation instincts. "This is insane!" Savannah shrieked, storming across the dance floor in her Vera Wang gown, her perfectly coiffed blonde hair bouncing with frantic anger. "You are all apologizing to her. Look at her. She's a fat, pathetic loser. And you." She pointed an accusatory finger at Gabriel, completely ignoring the guns pointed in her direction. "I don't know what kind of Mafia roleplay you're into, but you're probably just using her. Nobody like you could ever actually love a whale like her." Matteo raised his weapon, his finger tightening on the trigger, but Gabriel held up a single hand, stopping him. Gabriel looked at Savannah, not with anger, but with a chilling, predatory amusement. He pulled Chloe closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Using her? Little girl, you have absolutely no idea who your sister really is, do you?" "She's a boring accountant," Savannah sneered, tears of rage ruining her professional makeup. "She audits spreadsheets. She's nothing." "She is the senior forensic auditor at Deloitte," Gabriel corrected smoothly. "A woman who, 3 months ago, was assigned to quietly investigate the offshore holdings of Montgomery and Croft Wealth Partners. Tell me, Arthur," Gabriel called out to the groom's father, who was still trembling on the floor. "Did you think you could hide a multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme forever?" The ballroom went completely still. Derek Montgomery, the golden boy groom, whipped his head around to stare at his father. "Dad? What is he talking about?" Chloe finally stepped forward, moving out from under Gabriel's protective arm, though he kept his hand firmly on the small of her back. She looked directly at her sister, and for the first time in her life, Chloe let herself smile a true, sharp, dangerous smile. "He's talking about the fact that the Montgomery family is entirely bankrupt, Savannah," Chloe said, her voice ringing out clearly in the silent room. Savannah froze. "What?" "I found the discrepancies weeks ago," Chloe explained, the brilliant, analytical mind that Gabriel so deeply admired taking center stage. "Arthur Montgomery has been running a sophisticated Ponzi scheme for the last 8 years. He lost his clients' money in terrible crypto investments and has been using new client funds to pay off the old ones. The firm is short nearly $80 million. Chloe looked at Derek, whose jaw had dropped in horror. "Why do you think Derek proposed to you so quickly, Savannah? Why do you think the Montgomerys, an old money Connecticut family, suddenly wanted to merge with the Hendersons? They don't love you. They needed Daddy's real estate money to cover their margins before the Securities and Exchange Commission found out." "You're lying!" Savannah screamed, her voice cracking in hysteria. She looked at Derek. "Derek, tell her she's lying!" Derek couldn't meet her eyes. He looked down at the floor, his silence confirming every single word Chloe had spoken. "She doesn't lie," Gabriel murmured, looking at Chloe with a dark, burning pride. "My queen is the smartest person in any room she walks into. I just happen to be the only man intelligent enough to recognize it." Savannah stumbled backward, clutching her custom gown as if it were suddenly on fire. The perfect, curated illusion of her life was shattering in real time. She was married to a fraud, a criminal whose family was about to lose everything, and her wedding was now the scene of their public, spectacular ruin. "Consider this my wedding gift to you, Savannah," Gabriel said smoothly, snapping his fingers. Matteo stepped forward and dropped a silver USB drive onto the floor at Savannah's feet. That drive contains all of Chloe's forensic reports. A duplicate was emailed to the SEC and the FBI 20 minutes ago. By tomorrow morning, the Montgomery estates will be seized, and Arthur will be in federal custody. Gabriel wrapped his thick, muscular arm around Chloe's waist, pulling her flush against his side. He looked out over the ruined wedding, at the terrified socialites, the weeping groom, and the shattered, hysterical bride. "This city belongs to me," Gabriel promised the room, his voice a low, terrifying vow. "And from this moment forward, this woman belongs to me. If I catch wind that any of you have looked at her sideways, breathed her name in gossip, or so much as walked on the same side of the street as her, there won't be a hole deep enough for you to hide in. Do we understand each other?" A frantic, terrified chorus of "yes" and "we understand" echoed from the ultra-wealthy crowd. Gabriel didn't wait for another word. He turned on his heel, keeping Chloe tucked safely against his side, and began to walk toward the exit. The perimeter of armed men seamlessly folded inward, creating an impenetrable human shield around them as they exited the ballroom. They walked out into the cool, crisp night air of Long Island. A fleet of armored black Cadillac Escalades was idling in the circular driveway of the castle. The heavy, stifling atmosphere of the wedding vanished, replaced by the quiet, powerful hum of the V8 engines. Gabriel stopped by the open door of the lead SUV. He turned Chloe to face him. The lethal, terrifying Mafia boss, who had just brought 300 people to their knees, was gone. In his place was a man looking at the woman he loved with total, unconditional adoration. "You wore the yellow dress," Gabriel whispered, a small, genuine smile playing on his lips as his hands traced the hideous fabric. "I told you to buy the emerald silk one we looked at in Milan. I had to play the part one last time," Chloe admitted, a breathless, giddy laugh escaping her lips. The crushing weight she had carried for 29 years was gone. She felt light, beautiful, and completely invincible. "Thank you, Gabriel, for coming, for everything." Gabriel shook his head, his dark eyes fierce and intense. He leaned down, capturing her lips in a deep, consuming kiss that tasted of power, danger, and absolute devotion. When he finally pulled back, he rested his forehead against hers. "You never have to thank me for protecting my own heart, Chloe," he murmured, his thumb stroking her jawline. "Your family made you feel like you were too much to handle, but they were just too weak to carry a queen. Are you ready to go home?" Chloe looked back at the castle one last time. She could hear the faint, muffled sounds of Savannah screaming in the distance. She turned back to the Dark King, who had burned her old world to the ground just to keep her warm. "Yes," Chloe smiled, her heart soaring. "Take me home." Morning sunlight pierced through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Gabriel's Tribeca penthouse, casting long, golden geometric shapes across the tangled Egyptian cotton sheets. Chloe woke up slowly, her body heavy and completely relaxed in a way she had never experienced in her 29 years of life. For the first time, she was not bracing herself for a cruel comment. She was not instinctively sucking in her stomach or pulling the blanket up to hide her thick thighs. She lay on her side, entirely bare, feeling the solid, radiating heat of the most feared man in New York pressed flush against her back. Gabriel's heavy, muscular arm was draped possessively over her waist, his large hand resting flat against the soft curve of her belly. Even in sleep, He held her as if she were the center of his gravitational pull. Across the massive bedroom, the hideous mustard-yellow bridesmaid dress lay in a torn, crumpled heap on the expensive hardwood floor. Gabriel had quite literally ripped it off her the moment they stepped inside the penthouse the night before, cursing the cheap fabric and the toxic family that had forced her into it. In its place, he had draped her in worship, mapping every inch of her lush, plus-size body with a fierce, reverent passion that had left her breathless and entirely undone. "You are thinking too loudly, Mia Regina." Gabriel's deep, sleep-roughened voice rumbled against the nape of her neck. He pressed a warm kiss to her bare shoulder, pulling her even closer until there was not a fraction of space between them. Chloe smiled, leaning back into his solid chest. "I'm just wondering if last night was a dream. If I'm actually still locked in that bathroom at Oheka Castle, having a stress-induced hallucination." Gabriel shifted, propping himself up on one elbow so he could look down at her. His dark, abyssal eyes, usually so cold and lethal to the rest of the world, were utterly soft as they roamed over her beautiful, unadorned face. He reached out, his calloused thumb gently tracing the fullness of her lower lip. "I assure you, it was very real," Gabriel murmured. He reached over to the nightstand, grabbing a matte black remote. He clicked a button, and the massive flat-screen television embedded in the opposite wall hummed to life, already tuned to the morning news. "Look for yourself." Chloe sat up, pulling the silk sheet up to her chest, her eyes widening at the breaking news ticker flashing across the bottom of the screen. The aerial footage showed the sprawling Montgomery estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, completely surrounded by dozens of black tactical vehicles. FBI agents in windbreakers were carrying out boxes of physical files and computer hard drives. The news anchor's voice was breathy with excitement. "In a stunning overnight raid, federal authorities have apprehended Arthur Montgomery, CEO of Montgomery and Croft Wealth Partners, on massive federal fraud charges. Sources close to the investigation confirm that the firm was operating as an elaborate Ponzi scheme, defrauding investors of nearly $80 million. In a bizarre twist, Montgomery was arrested in his tuxedo, having just fled his son's lavish wedding at Oheka Castle. The screen cut to footage captured from a cell phone outside the castle. It showed Derek Montgomery, the arrogant golden boy groom, crying on the hood of a police cruiser as he was placed in handcuffs for questioning. Behind him, Savannah was screaming hysterically, tearing at the tulle of her custom Vera Wang gown as she tried to slap a camera away from her face. Chloe exhaled a long, shaky breath, leaning her head back against Gabriel's shoulder. "It's really over. They lost everything." "Not just the Montgomerys, Chloe," Gabriel said softly, his tone carrying a dark, knowing edge. He gently ran his fingers through her messy hair. "Tell me what else you found in those ledgers when you were auditing the firm." Chloe hesitated, looking down at her hands. The brilliance of her mind was a terrifying weapon when she actually chose to wield it. Arthur Montgomery needed an injection of liquid cash to keep the SEC off his back for just a few more weeks. He convinced my parents that he was doing them a massive favor by letting them into an exclusive off-the-books crypto portfolio reserved only for billionaires. Gabriel smiled, a dark, predatory smirk that made him look every inch the Mafia kingpin. "And your parents, desperate to prove they belonged in that tier of high society, took the bait. They took out a massive second mortgage on their house in the Hamptons," Chloe confirmed, her voice devoid of any sympathy. "They drained their entire retirement fund, my father's corporate stock options, and the trust fund they had set up for Savannah. They handed Arthur Montgomery $7 million in untraceable wire transfers 48 hours before the wedding. It's all gone. Every single cent is tied up in federal evidence, and because it was an unregistered illegal investment, the government will seize it. Gabriel let out a low, approving hum. He leaned down, kissing the soft curve of her breast just above the sheet. My brilliant, ruthless queen, you didn't just expose a fraud. You completely bankrupted the people who abused you, and you did it without firing a single bullet. I didn't do it to ruin them, Chloe whispered, looking back at the television as Savannah's sobbing face flashed across the screen. I did it because it was the truth. They built their entire lives on lies and cruelty. They judged me for taking up space, for having fat on my body, while their own souls were entirely hollow. Gravity just finally caught up with them. Gabriel cupped her face, forcing her to look away from the screen and directly into his intense, burning gaze. They do not matter anymore. Their world is ashes. This is your world now. And I will spend the rest of my life making sure you have everything you were ever denied. 6 months later, the Manhattan skyline glittered through the panoramic windows of the newly established Moretti Holdings corporate headquarters. Chloe stood at the head of a massive mahogany boardroom table, projecting a quarterly financial review onto the smart screen behind her. She was not the same shrinking, terrified woman who had tried to hide in a yellow dress. She wore a custom-tailored emerald green silk blazer that cinched perfectly at her waist, accentuating her lush curves rather than hiding them. Her hair was blown out in sleek, confident waves, and a pair of diamond studs, a Tuesday gift from Gabriel, sparkled at her ears. Surrounding the table were 15 of the most dangerous men in the city. Matteo, the heavily tattooed underboss, sat to her right, aggressively taking notes on an iPad. The capos of the Moretti syndicate, men who usually dealt in extortion, illegal shipments, and violence, were currently hanging on to Chloe's every word as if she were a prophet. By filtering the cash from the docks through the newly acquired boutique hotel chains, we've managed to completely legitimize 30% of the syndicate's liquid assets this quarter, Chloe explained, her voice steady and commanding. She tapped a laser pointer against the graph. The IRS has entirely backed off the logistics front. If we continue aggressive real estate acquisitions in the Bronx, we will double our clean revenue by next spring, minimizing federal risk to zero. Matteo looked up, a rare, genuine grin crossing his scarred face. So you're telling me we just made $8 million clean dollars by buying run-down buildings and actually fixing them up? Exactly, Chloe smiled, resting her hands on the table. You don't need to break legs when you can weaponize compound interest and gentrification, Matteo. A low murmur of deep, absolute respect rumbled through the room. The men of the Moretti family didn't just tolerate Chloe because she was the boss's woman. They worshipped her. In 6 months, her brilliant financial mind had saved 3 of them from federal indictments and doubled the family's legitimate wealth. She was the undisputed queen of the syndicate, protecting them with ledgers and tax loopholes, while they protected her with bullets and blood. The heavy boardroom doors opened, and Gabriel walked in. The temperature in the room immediately shifted, the capos straightening in their chairs out of sheer instinct. Gabriel was dressed in a sleek, charcoal 3-piece suit, his dark eyes instantly zeroing in on Chloe. He didn't care about the quarterly profits on the screen. He only cared about the woman presenting them. "Meeting adjourned," Gabriel ordered smoothly. The 15 lethal men stood up immediately, gathering their tablets and filing out of the room, without a single word of complaint. Matteo tipped his head respectfully to Chloe, before pulling the heavy doors shut behind him. leaving Gabriel and Chloe alone in the vast, silent boardroom. Gabriel crossed the room with slow, predatory grace. He stopped right in front of her, his large hands immediately coming up to grip her thick hips. He pulled her flush against him, burying his face in the crook of her neck and inhaling deeply. "You are working too hard, mia dolcezza," Gabriel murmured, pressing an open-mouthed kiss against her pulse point. "I did not build you an empire so you could spend your afternoons looking at tax codes." Chloe laughed, wrapping her arms around his broad shoulders. She loved the contrast of him, this terrifying, violent man who melted into absolute devotion the second they were alone. "I enjoy it, Gabrielle. Taking your chaotic, illegal money and making it bulletproof is the most fun I've ever had." Gabriel pulled back slightly, his dark eyes tracing her features. "You look breathtaking today. That green silk was made for your body." "Thank you," she smiled softly. She had finally learned to accept his compliments without deflection. She loved her fat, beautiful body. She loved the way it filled out her clothes, the way it commanded space, and most importantly, the way it completely unraveled the Mafia kingpin standing before her. Gabriel's phone buzzed in his breast pocket. He ignored it. But then Chloe's encrypted tablet chimed on the desk. She glanced over at the screen, her smile fading slightly. It was an email forwarded by her private security team. The subject line read, "Please, Chloe, it's Mum." Gabriel noticed the shift in her expression. His jaw tightened, a dangerous, violent shadow crossing his face. "Did they breach the firewall again?" Chloe sighed, picking up the tablet. Over the last 6 months, the fallout of the Oaxaca Castle disaster had been absolute. Arthur Montgomery was serving 20 years in federal prison. Derek was working as a valet at a casino in Atlantic City, his trust fund entirely seized. But her own family had suffered a quieter, more humiliating fate. Completely bankrupt and blacklisted from high society due to their association with the Montgomery fraud, Brenda and her husband had been forced to sell their Hamptons estate to cover their debts. Savannah, whose entire identity was wrapped up in her wealth and her sample-size waistline, had suffered a massive public breakdown. Without her family's money to fund her lavish lifestyle, the former golden child was currently working a minimum-wage retail job in a strip mall in New Jersey, living in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment with her parents. "She's begging for a loan," Chloe read the email aloud, her voice devoid of emotion. "She says Savannah's car got repossessed and Dad needs money for his blood pressure medication. She's asking for $50,000. She says they are starving." Gabriel's eyes went dead. He reached into his jacket, resting his hand on the cold steel of his firearm. "Give me the word, Chloe. Say the word, and I will have Matteo drive out to New Jersey tonight. They will never send you an email again." Chloe looked at the screen for a long moment. A younger version of herself would have felt guilty. She would have transferred the money, desperate to buy the love and approval of a mother who had only ever looked at her with disgust. She would have apologized for her own success. Instead, Chloe deleted the email. She blocked the IP address entirely, wiping the last digital trace of her toxic family from her life. "No," Chloe said, looking up at Gabriel, her eyes clear and unbothered. "They aren't worth the bullets, Gabriel. Let them live in the ruins they built. They wanted a thin, beautiful, perfect life. Let them see how hollow it really is." Gabriel stared at her, a profound, overwhelming pride radiating from his chest. He took the tablet from her hands, tossing it carelessly onto the table, and pulled her tightly against his chest. "You are magnificent," he whispered fiercely, his hand sliding down to cup the lush curve of her backside, pressing her against him. You are my entire world. Gabriel stepped back, keeping one hand on her waist. He reached into his trouser pocket and pulled out a small, heavy velvet box. Chloe's breath hitched as he flipped it open. Inside rested a massive, flawless canary diamond, surrounded by intricate, custom-forged platinum that looked exactly like a crown. "I am a man of violence, Chloe," Gabriel said, his voice dropping to a low, raw rumble. "I live in the shadows, and my soul is stained with things you should never have to look at. But you are my light. You are the genius that guides my empire, and the only woman who has ever commanded my knees to hit the floor. Marry me. Let me spend the rest of my life worshipping you exactly as you are." Tears pricked the corners of Chloe's eyes, but this time they were tears of absolute triumph and joy. She looked at the ring, a crown fit for a queen, and then up at the dark king who held it. She didn't need to shrink herself to fit into his world. She had simply needed a kingdom large enough to hold her. "Yes," Chloe whispered, throwing her arms around his neck. "Yes, Gabriel." He slipped the heavy diamond onto her finger, the fit absolute perfection, before capturing her lips in a kiss that promised a lifetime of power, protection, and unconditional, burning devotion. The little fat girl from a cruel, shallow family was dead. The queen of the Moretti Empire had finally taken her throne, and her reign was just beginning. If you loved this story about a brilliant, powerful woman claiming her worth, refusing to shrink for toxic family members, and finding a dark, devoted love that worships her exactly as she is, we need your help to tell more stories like this. Smash that like button, drop a comment below, telling us your favorite twist from Chloe's Revenge, and share this video with anyone who needs a reminder of their own power. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss out on our daily drama and romance drops.